Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with the strangely logical decision to sleep on the ground, because if you were living on the Great Plains, dragging a bed frame across 200 miles of grassland would have been the dumbest idea imaginable. From hides piled thicker than any mattress, to smoke flaps that turned your bedroom into a living lung, to the unsettling fact that snowdrifts were sometimes part of your insulations, leaping in a tipi wasn't primitive. It was genius wrapped in buffalo skin. So before we sink into the firelight, take a moment to like this video and subscribe only if you actually enjoy what I do here. No hard sell, just a quiet nudge. And I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how this little circle of people stretches across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, or a cup of tea if you've got one nearby. Settle in close to the ground, and let's slip into tonight's story together. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Not the one sprawled on a memory foam mattress with 3 pillows, a weighted blanket, and an app tracking your REM cycles. No, picture yourself as someone who thought the ground was perfectly fine for sleeping as long as you had a buffalo robe, a good fire, and walls that looked like they were designed by a geometry-obsessed wind spirit. If you'd been born on the Great Plains a couple of centuries ago, your idea of a bedroom set would have been a bundle of poles, a hide cover, and an east-facing doorway. Forget Casper mattresses and Scandinavian bed frames. You'd have laughed at the very idea. A bed, that's cute. Does it roll up, travel with the bison herd, and survive a windstorm? No, then it's useless. See, here's the first thing you need to know. Not all native peoples slept in Tipis. The plains were tipi country, yes. But go far enough into the forests of the northeast, and you'd find longhouses with raised sleeping platforms. Wander down to the southwest, and you'd see adobe homes with flat roofs, where people sometimes slept under the stars. The tipi was the invention of necessity, a structure for the nomadic horse and bison economies of the plains. Lakota, Dakota, Blackfoot, Crow, Cheyenne, Arapaho, these names were tied to the tipi. Not every indigenous person on the continent was rolling up hides and pitching a cone every few weeks. So if you want to imagine yourself in this life, strip away the Hollywood myth that all Native Americans lived in tipis. That's like saying everyone in Europe lived in castles, which, sure, is great for fairy tales, but deeply inconvenient if you're just trying to milk a goat. Now, why the tipi? Why not just stick to a cabin, or pile some branches together like the rest of us might? Because the plains aren't exactly forgiving. We're talking wide horizons, sudden blizzards, summer lightning storms, and winds so sharp they could file your cheekbones for you. The tipi's conical shape wasn't an aesthetic flourish, it was aerodynamic survival. Those slanted walls shrugged off gales and let snow slide down instead of caving in. You can't say the same for a flat roof shack when the prairie starts hurling ice sideways. And about sleeping arrangements. Yes, you slept on the ground, not bare dirt. Obviously you weren't an animal, no matter what 19th century settlers wrote in their diaries, with all the subtlety of bad Yelp reviews. The ground was prepared, sometimes lined with mats of reeds or grass, then layered with hides and robes. It was warm, flexible, and most importantly portable. Beds, in the European sense, would have been an absolute joke here. What are you going to do? Haul a carved wooden frame across 200 miles of prairie because your spine might get cranky? Good luck explaining that to your horse. And you didn't just plop down anywhere inside the lodge. The tipi had a strict choreography. Family positions were laid out by custom, the fire at the center, door usually facing east to catch the morning sun. Sleeping arrangements radiated around that hearth like slices of a pie, each slice assigned by kinship and role. Beds weren't just impractical, they were unnecessary. The whole point was efficiency, mobility, and fitting seamlessly into a living, breathing circle of fire, smoke, wind, and hides. So here you are, lying on the ground in a tipi. And before you groan about back pain, remember, you're surrounded by buffalo robes thicker than your duvet, insulated by a structure that can breathe in summer and trap heat in winter, and held together by the simple genius of poles, hides, and communal memory. And that's just scratching the surface. Because if you're wondering why you didn't end up with a 4-poster bed and a drafty log cabin, the real answer isn't just about sleep, it's about moving, adapting, and surviving. Which brings us straight to the next question. How exactly did mobility dictate every part of this home, down to what you slept on? So, Imagine you're packing up your life, not just clothes, not just a tent for camping season, but everything. Your home, your bed, your tools, your cooking pots. And because this is the plains, possibly the fresh skeleton of a bison you're planning to turn into dinner and clothing. Now, would you seriously pause to strap a four-legged oak bed frame onto a travois and drag it across 100 miles of prairie? Exactly. Beds, as we like to picture them, fixed, heavy, proud statements of domestic permanence, made absolutely no sense here. Mobility wasn't just convenient, it was the whole game. The Great Plains were ruled by bison, not humans, and bison don't stand still. They moved with the seasons, chasing pastures, and if you wanted to eat, you moved with them. That meant your home had to collapse, fold, and reappear with the grace of an accordion. A tipi was a perfect fit, a bundle of long poles and a stitched hide cover, light enough for horses or, before them, dogs to drag on the same poles that held up your lodge one night could be tied into a dragging frame the next morning, loaded with gear, and pulled across the grasslands. Try that with a walnut sleigh bed. It doesn't end well. And here's where it gets clever, because the whole community moved together. Efficiency wasn't just personal preference, it was survival. You can't have one family holding everyone back because Auntie insists on bringing her canopy bed. No. The system demanded everything from cookware to bedding be portable, packable, and functional. So bedding wasn't a piece of furniture, it was furniture as fabric. Robes, mats, hides. By day, they rolled up neatly. By night, they unrolled into comfort. It was like living with a minimalist IKEA catalog, but with far better insulation. But let's not romanticize it. Too much mobility also meant compromise. Every extra pound slowed you down. Horses helped. Sure, but the logistics of moving an entire village, sometimes every few weeks, were intense. Picture the process. The poles are unlashed, hides folded, bedding rolled, goods lashed to frames, dogs or horses strapped into place, and the whole caravan stretches out across the horizon. If you've ever whined about moving apartments because you had to carry a mattress up to flights of stairs, imagine doing it twice a month, across a landscape that had no stairs, just endless wind and grass. And yet, it worked. The travois was brilliantly simple. 2 long poles crossed and lashed to an animal's back, dragging loads across the ground. Before the arrival of horses in the 17th century, dogs did the hauling shorter distances, smaller loads. After horses arrived, the scale exploded. Suddenly, tipis could be bigger, covers heavier, and bedding more abundant. But still, no matter how big your tipi got, no one ever thought, you know what would really improve this? A 200-pound bed frame. That's because everyone understood that mobility is freedom. Beds tie you down. Robes and hides set you free. And if you're still tempted to picture yourself sneaking a bed along, just think of the landscape itself. Rolling prairie, sudden storms, fire sweeping the grasslands. When you had to move, you really had to move. A tipi could be taken down in under an hour, packed and gone. Beds, they'd just burn. You might as well be carrying dead weight straight into disaster. So you, lying there at night on your hides, weren't making do without a bed. You were making a calculated choice, better to carry your world lightly and move with the herd than drag your comforts until they became your coffin. And that practicality flowed right into the design of the tipi itself. The very anatomy of the thing dictated how and where you slept. Which of course leads us to what that structure was actually made of, and why every pole and flap mattered more than any bedpost ever could. Alright, so you've given up on the fantasy of dragging a canopy bed across the plains. Good. Now, let's crawl inside this thing you're calling home. A tipi isn't just a tent, it's a piece of living architecture, engineered by centuries of observation, trial, and error. Every pole, every flap, every stitch of hide has a purpose, and that purpose ends up shaping how, where, and why you sleep the way you do. First, the skeleton. Long lodgepole pines, stripped smooth, set into a tripod, and fanned out to create a cone. It looks simple, but the geometry is exact. Too steep, and smoke chokes the rafters. Too shallow, and the wind rips it apart. This wasn't winging it. It was math written in wood and wind. Around that frame, hides buffalo in the old days. Canvas later was stitched and draped, staked to the ground with deliberate precision. You're not just throwing up fabric. You're building a weather machine. And here's the genius. Tipis breathe, literally. At the top, 2 smoke flaps open and close with poles like the lungs of the lodge. Down at the base, where the hides meet the ground, a gap lets air in. Now put a fire in the middle. Suddenly, you've got a convection system that would make modern architects sweat with envy. Cool air comes in low, rises as it warms, carries smoke up and out. That's why you, the sleeper, are stretched out on the ground, not up high in a bed frame. Because the sweet spot in that system isn't at head height, it's low, where the air is warm, calm, and breathable. Beds would have left you in the draft, or worse, in the smoke stream. Congratulations! By refusing a bed, you just invented a better HVAC system. Then there's the liner, sometimes called the dewcloth, a second interior wall hung from the poles, rising chest high and curving in. It looks decorative, but it's doing heavy work, trapping warmth, blocking drafts, and guiding air currents upward. Behind it, the Ozana sort of partial sealing or canopy catches condensation, directs smoke, and makes sure that if a rainstorm blows in sideways, your bedroll doesn't become a puddle. You see what's happening? The tipi isn't a primitive tent. It's a climate-regulated dome with airflow calibrated by hand. And every choice liner height, flap, angle, staking tension affects how comfortably you sleep. And don't forget the door. Always low, always east-facing, if possible, catching the sunrise. That means your first light of the day isn't from a clock, but from the horizon itself, spilling over you on the ground. And because the door flap is low, everyone stoops entering and leaving, a gesture that turns every bedtime into a reminder. Yes, you're sleeping in a sacred circle, not just a box with furniture. Now, think about what this does to your body. Instead of climbing into a raised, isolated bed, you curl into bedding arranged along the wall, close to the liner, in that insulated pocket. You're breathing warmed air, shielded from drafts, cushioned by hides. You're also sleeping in a circle with your family, every position mapped by custom. Each body part of the lodge is balanced. The tipi itself shapes your sleep literally. Architecturally, beds don't just look silly here, they'd break the system. So the next time you complain about your apartment getting drafty in winter, imagine lying in a cone of poles and hides, smoke rising above you, air flowing around you like you're inside a giant breathing lung. And all because people figured out that the ground wasn't the problem, it was the solution. Which is why, when we talk about sleeping in a tipi, we can't separate it from the ground itself. That dirt floor wasn't just where you put your bedroll, it was part of the heating system. Now here's the part modern ears don't quite like. The ground itself wasn't an inconvenience, it was the whole point. You, in your imagined plains life, didn't roll out of bed and curse the cold floorboards because there weren't any floorboards. The floor was the ground, and the ground was stitched right into the heating and cooling system of the tipi. That dirt under your bedding wasn't just where you slept, it was your mattress, your insulation, and occasionally your radiator. Think of the tipi like a living furnace. The central fire was the obvious heat source, but the magic was in the way the structure used the earth beneath it. Air came in low at the base, circled behind the liner, picked up warmth, and rose out through the smoke hole. And where were you in this little airflow experiment? Not perched up high like a roast chicken on a spit, but nestled low, close to the liner, directly in the pocket where warm air pooled. Beds raised off the ground would have thrown you into the draft zone. You'd wake up coughing, smoke, and muttering about which god forgot to design proper circulation. Sleeping low kept you in the sweet spot, warm without choking, insulated without drowning in condensation. And don't underestimate the ground's role as a regulator. In the winter, the earth holds onto warmth from the fire. In the summer, it keeps things cooler than the sweltering air outside. It's thermal mass. Centuries before engineers started using that term to make eco-homes sound revolutionary. The dirt floor was a silent stabilizer, balancing extremes, smoothing out the spikes of heat and cold that made the plains notorious for mood swings. You weren't enduring the ground, you were harnessing it. Of course, nobody just lay straight on bare earth like a saint awaiting martyrdom. Surfaces were prepared, sometimes grass mats, sometimes woven reeds, sometimes a layer of hides under the bedding. Buffalo robes stacked on top turned the floor into a warm, padded nest. Roll them up in the morning, and the same ground that was your mattress became your living room, your workbench, your ceremonial hall. Beds divide space into sleeping and waking. The ground united them. Now, there's an irony here. In modern life, people pay absurd sums for underfloor heating pipes, pumping warm water beneath engineered wood planks. Meanwhile, your ancestors on the plains had perfected the free version. Let the earth soak up heat from the fire and release it slowly through the night. No thermostat, no energy bill, just knowledge of how air, heat, and soil dance together. And because the hearth sat at the center, warmth radiated outward, hitting the liner and circulating right back to where you slept. The system only worked if you were low enough to catch it. Raised bedsteads would have been like climbing onto the roof of your house to sleep because you think higher is better. Congratulations, you just signed yourself up for the smoky zone. The ground wasn't primitive, it was strategic placement. So there you are, curled against hides and mats, fire crackling, warmth rising around you, smoke drawn up and away. The floor beneath you isn't a downgrade from a bed frame. It's a part of the house's lungs, a functional organ of the shelter. And if you ever wondered why plains people didn't upgrade to beds, the answer is obvious. Beds would have broken the physics of the home itself. The ground worked with the fire, with the liner, with the wind. To ignore it would have been like ripping out the heart of the tipi. And speaking of bedding, because hides and robes deserve more than a passing mention, that's where we go next. What exactly cushioned you at night, and why those buffalo hides were worth more than any mattress tag promising orthopedic support. So let's talk about what you actually slept on. Since by now we've established the ground was your bed frame. Spoiler, it wasn't hay and nails. It was better. Your bedding wasn't a single object, but a carefully curated ecosystem of hides, robes, and mats. If you'd lived on the plains, you wouldn't have a mattress with a brand name. Your bed would have been a pile of buffalo. Literally, buffalo robes were the gold standard. Thick, insulating, and durable. They kept you warm in a tipi through winters, where the wind had a personal vendetta. Each robe could be softened, smoked, and dressed for maximum comfort. Layer 2 or 3 together, and suddenly the floor feels less like dirt and more like the best heated mattress pad you've ever owned. And no, they didn't squeak like metal springs or need flipping every 3 months. You just rolled them up in the morning and got on with life. Try rolling up your memory foam and carrying it 50 miles. See how long your spine lasts. And it wasn't just hides. Mats woven from reeds or grasses could go down first, smoothing the floor and adding insulation. Quilts and blankets later, after trade goods came in, were sometimes stacked on top. Bedding was flexible, adaptive, and lightweight enough to pack at dawn. A real bed, the kind with posts and slats. That's dead weight, the sort of thing that turns into a bonfire when you realize you can't haul it another step. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just about comfort. Bedding was a social and economic indicator. To a family with plenty of robes had not only warmth, but wealth. Hides required successful hunts, tanning skills, and networks of exchange. Your bedding literally spoke of your household's prosperity. In some cases, robes were gifted, traded, or used in ceremonies. So when you curled into one at night, you weren't just getting cozy, you were wrapping yourself in the tangible proof of survival and community. Compare that to your fitted sheet set from the discount aisle. Not quite the same story, is it? And unlike a mattress that pretends to be personalized support for your body type, these sleeping systems actually adapted to the seasons. Summer, thin mats and a single robe. Winter, layer upon layer, building a nest that could survive temperatures that would paralyze your Wi-Fi router. If it got unbearably cold, everyone shifted closer to the fire, bedding arranged in arcs around the central hearth. This wasn't just sleep, it was strategic hibernation. Now, let's be clear, beds weren't absent because plains people couldn't imagine them. Other native groups, especially in regions with longhouses, had raised sleeping platforms made of wood. Europeans brought furniture across the ocean, sure, but for the plains, impractical. Why haul timber-heavy frames across open grassland when hides gave you warmth, portability, and flexibility? Beds were a liability. Bedding was a liberation. And if you've ever bragged about your portable air mattress for camping, let me tell you, you're late to the party by a few centuries. Plains bedding was the original portable sleep technology, except it didn't deflate at 3 a.m. and leave you lying on cold gravel while you curse your life choices. So the next time you tuck yourself into a mass-produced mattress, imagine the alternative. A pile of buffalo robes, firelight flickering across the tipi walls, air circulating just right, and the knowledge that when dawn came, you could roll the whole system into a bundle and be gone before the horizon shifted. That wasn't lack of luxury. That was luxury designed for survival. And speaking of survival, bedding alone wasn't enough. The tipi itself had seasonal hacks, liners, hose bands, and smoke flaps that fine-tuned the environment and decided how comfortable or unbearably your night really was. Now that you're nestled in your robe pile, let's get serious about climate control, because the plains didn't care about your comfort. Summers could roast you like a grasshopper on a skillet. Winters could freeze the marrow in your bones. And the wind, well, the wind was basically a full-time character in your life. The tipi didn't just keep you dry. It was a year-round machine for survival, and its seasonal tuning was brilliant. Take the liner, that inner curtain hanging inside the tipi. To an outsider, it might look like decorations, some quaint bit of interior design before the word decor even existed. But no, the liner was a thermal regulator, a draft blocker, a smoke director. In winter, it sealed the base of the lodge, forcing cold air to flow upward behind it, while the fire's warmth circulated back into your living space. In summer, you could raise parts of it, letting breezes move through without collapsing the whole system. Think of it as ancient climate tech. Your great-grandparents had a smart thermostat. It just happened to be made of hides. Then there's the ozan, that partial ceiling stretched inside above your sleeping area. Sounds fancy, doesn't it? A little canopy in a cone-shaped house. But again, it wasn't for show. The ozan caught condensation dripping from the cover and kept it from falling directly onto your head at 2 a.m. when the fire died down. It also helped trap warmth over the sleeping area in cold weather, turning your nest of robes into a microclimate inside the bigger microclimate. Basically, the ozan was proof that even in a conical hide shelter, no one wanted to wake up with rainwater dripping down their nose. And the smoke, flapso, those are genius. At the very top of the tipi, two adjustable flaps acted like lungs. Point them into or away from the wind, and you could control whether smoke lingered or vanished. On cold, still nights, the flaps could be nearly shut to trap heat. On hot days, they opened wide, pulling hot air out like a chimney. They responded not to some preset app notification, but to actual human judgment. You or someone else had to get up, grab the flap poles, and adjust them, which meant climate control also doubled as a midnight chore. Forget pushing a button on your thermostat, you got to poke at the sky with poles in the dark, hoping you didn't mess up and turn your bedroom into a smokehouse. But when managed right, the system was astonishingly efficient. Accounts from traders and ethnographies describe Tipis as warm in winter, cool in summer, and surprisingly dry compared to the drafty cabins Europeans tried to force onto the plains. And the truth is, cabins with fixed chimneys often failed in the same storms Tipis shrugged off. Imagine surviving a blizzard in a square log house with leaky gaps versus in a cone-shaped hide lodge designed to flex and breathe with the wind. One looks sturdy, the other actually works. So here you are, sleeping low, tucked behind the liner, under the ozone fire, sending smoke out through flaps angled just right. In summer, you're cool. In winter, you're wrapped in warmth that actually circulates rather than leaks. No insulation contractors, no double-glazed windows, just knowledge passed down, perfected, and tuned every day. And this is where it gets good. Because once you've experienced how liners, ozans, and smoke flaps keep you alive in extremes, you realize something. Sleeping in a tipi wasn't a primitive compromise. It was better than half the innovations people still pay engineers to invent. Which is why, even in the dead of winter, there are records of plains. Families sleeping comfortably when settlers in their wooden boxes were freezing beside their iron stoves. And that leads us straight into the heart of it. Winter wasn't endured inside a tipi, it was mastered. So let's test this tipi setup against the worst-case scenario. The plains in January. You're imagining misery already, aren't you? Whiteout blizzards, teeth chattering, fingers numb. The kind of cold that makes you question whether life is worth living outside a radiator. Except here's the twist. If you were tucked into a well-run tipi, you might have been warmer and healthier than a settler shivering in a log cabin. Why? It starts with heat distribution. The central hearth wasn't just for cooking. It was a steady thermal engine. Flames lit low, liner snugged tight, smoke flaps angled against the wind. It created a pocket of warmth that collected exactly where you slept. And buffalo robes weren't decorative trophies. They were insulation thick enough to survive wind chills that would kill a smartphone battery in 2 minutes. Wrap yourself in a couple of those, and suddenly the ground feels like a heated platform, radiating back the fire's gift long into the night. Now, compare that to cabins. Settlers often complained of drafts, smoke-choked interiors, and frost creeping across the inside walls. A chimney in one corner created uneven heat, so you roasted on one side and froze on the other. In a tipi, heat spread centrally, air circulated by design, and even in howling storms, the conical structure resisted collapse. There are accounts of snow piling halfway up the sides, acting as insulation, while inside families sat comfortably, trading stories in the glow of the fire. Health-wise, this mattered more than comfort. Winters on the plains could last long, and respiratory illnesses were a constant risk. The ventilation system of the tipi, the smoke flaps, the liner, the rising airment smoke didn't stagnate and poison you. Sure, you still smelled like a campfire, but you weren't suffocating in creosote. Settler cabins, meanwhile, often had families coughing through entire seasons, eyes watering, lungs clogged from poorly vented stoves. The irony: the so-called civilized homes were killing their inhabitants faster than the primitive tents. And don't forget mobility. A tipi could be pitched where shelter from wind was best near a bluff, in a hollow, shielded by trees. Cabins nailed settlers down in one spot, whether or not it was strategically sound. When the storm shifted, you endured it. In a tipi, you adapted. That choice mobility over permanence wasn't aesthetic, it was survival math. But here's the part you wouldn't expect. Winters inside a tipi weren't just survivable, they could be socially rich. The shared space, the fire, the warmth of bodazol created intimacy. Families sang, told stories, repaired tools, and deepened ties while the world outside froze solid. In that sense, winter wasn't only endured, was transformed into time for memory, teaching, and rest. Modern people might call that seasonal affective therapy. Back then, it was just the natural rhythm of the lodge. So the next time you imagine native families on the plains, don't picture them shivering in misery. Picture a circle of light in the storm, fire crackling, hides layered thick, air clear and breathable, warmth pooling around sleepers. Settlers wrote in their journals about freezing to death in real houses, while tipis nearby glowed like lanterns in the snow. The so-called primitive home was actually the superior one. And of course, this design wasn't just about braving winter. The tipi's interior wasn't a bedroom, it was everything at once, which meant space had to be managed with brutal efficiency. No room for clunky bed frames when every square foot mattered. Here's something modern furniture stores don't tell you. Beds are tyrants. They hog space, dominate a room, and silently dictate how everyone else has to move around them. In a tipi, that kind of nonsense wouldn't fly. You didn't have the luxury of a bedroom set. You had a circle, a fire, and the need to make every inch earn its keep. Space efficiency wasn't just good design, it was survival etiquette. Picture the interior, a conical chamber, maybe 15 to 20 feet across, fire in the center, smoke rising above. Around the edges, bedding, tools, food stores, and the occasional sacred object. Now, where exactly are you going to wedge a bulky filter right in front of the door, over the fire? Congratulations, you've just killed everyone with smoke inhalation. Beds weren't absent because no one thought of them. They were absent because they were spatially insane. Sleeping gear had to flex with the rhythm of life. At night, hides unrolled along the wall, tucked behind the liner, circling the hearth like petals around a flower. By day, those same hides rolled away, and suddenly the space was free for cooking, sewing, storytelling, or ritual. The ground was multi-purpose, elastic. A bed frame would have been like a stubborn guest, refusing to move even after the feast was over, always in the way, never useful at the right moment. And the round plan magnified this. A circle has no corners to hide furniture in. Everything is in sight, everything participates. Unlike a square cabin where you can shove clutter into the corner and pretend it's not there, a tipi made you confront your possessions. If it didn't serve multiple roles, it didn't belong. Beds, by that standard, failed spectacularly. They served one function, consumed space 24/7, and couldn't even double as a storage box. No wonder they were left out. There's also a choreography to movement in the lodge. People entered low through the eastern door, fire in the middle, sleeping and storage arranged in designated zones. Families respected invisible boundaries, knowing whose spot was whose. Guests were placed strategically, sometimes near the door, sometimes opposite, depending on custom and status. Imagine trying to navigate that with a big wooden bed cutting off the path. You'd trip, spill ash, or worse knock over a pot of stew. And then you'd have to explain to the entire household why you'd chosen interior decoration over basic functionality. In fact, the Tipis' spatial economy was so precise that outsiders often misunderstood it as empty. To European eyes, accustomed to heavy furniture and clutter, the tipi looked sparse. But that wasn't poverty, it was efficiency. Everything that needed to exist was there, but in forms that rolled, folded, stacked, or shifted. A minimalist dream. Centuries before minimalism became an aesthetic you pay influencers to lecture you about. And remember, every item also had to travel. Space inside the tipi wasn't just limited by walls, it was limited by the number of poles, hides, and horses you could manage on the move. Beds failed the ultimate test. They couldn't justify their footprint once the tipi came down. Rollable bedding, perfect wooden bed frame, useless ballast. So when you stretch out along the wall at night, don't think of yourself as someone deprived of a bed. Think of yourself as someone living in a perfectly tuned circle, where every square foot breathes, adapts, and transforms with the day. Beds freeze space in one roll. The tipi liberated it, and that liberation wasn't just about geometry, it was also about who did the work of keeping everything portable and practical. Which means we need to talk about the people who made, pitched, and packed these homes, the women, and the logistics that turned a pile of poles and hides into a functioning household. So, who exactly kept this whole portable-large lifestyle running? Spoiler, not the men strutting around talking about bison hunts. The real engineers of tipi life were women. If you had been born into a plains household, chances are your mother, sisters, or wife would have been the reason you had shelter at all. Tipis weren't just homes, they were entire logistical systems, and women were the architects, builders, and managers. Let's start at the beginning, the making. Constructing a tipi cover from buffalo hides wasn't a lazy afternoon craft. A large lodge could take more than a dozen hides, tanned, softened, smoked, stitched, and cut with geometric precision so they'd fit the cone without sagging. That's pattern making on a level your modern sewing machine could only dream about. And once canvas entered the picture through trade, the same expertise applied. Women measured, cut, and sewed massive sheets, transforming foreign material into a structure still perfectly attuned to plains winds. Pitching the lodge, also women's work. They hauled the poles, raised the tripod, spread the bundle, hoisted the cover, and staked it down. Efficiency mattered. Entire camps could be erected or dismantled in under an hour, which is more than you can say for the average family trying to set up a weekend tent from the sporting goods store. And when it came time to move, women dismantled, packed, and lashed everything onto horses or, before them, onto dogs with those long poles you see in old sketches, dragging across the grass with bundles tied at the end. Women balanced and loaded those. This portability wasn't optional. It was the heart of plains survival. Bison herds moved, and so did people. A home that lagged meant starvation. Every item was judged by its ability to travel. A heavy bed frame wasn't just impractical, it was an insult to the system women maintained with ruthless pragmatism. Bedding, yes. Poles, yes. Cooking tools, yes. Furniture, don't even think about it. The women who ran this operation weren't interested in dead weight. And here's the irony. European observers often dismissed women's tipi work as domestic, as though it was somehow lesser than the men's hunting or warfare. But who actually ensured survival? A man might bring down a bison, but without a functioning lodge, he'd be eating it in the snow, coughing on smoke, and freezing by dawn. Women literally engineered the climate-controlled mobile homes that allowed men to survive long enough to go hunting in the first place. If that's not infrastructure management, I don't know what is. It also meant women held authority over the tipi itself. In many plain societies, the lodge was hers. She owned it, she managed it, and if a man displeased her badly enough, she could set his belongings outside and effectively divorce him by lodge eviction. No court paperwork, just your stuff's outside. Good luck. Imagine being tossed out of your marriage along with the realization that you've lost your only climate-controlled housing. Brutal. Effective. So as you picture yourself bedding down in the tipi, remember, you're lying in a system built and maintained by women's labor, skill, and authority. And the reason you're not rolling off a bed frame in a windstorm is because they had the sense to design homes that folded up, strapped down, and moved on. Beds didn't fit in that equation, but buffalo robes and poles did. And while materials mattered, the hides, the poles, the stakes, it's worth asking, why didn't anyone try to build beds out of wood in the first place? That brings us to the next problem. The plains weren't exactly generous with timber. Here's a detail that often slips past modern imagination. The plains weren't covered in lumber. You can't build a four-poster bed if the nearest forest is 100 miles away and the only trees around. You are scraggly cottonwoods clinging to a riverbank like bad movers. Wood was precious, scarce, and worth far more as poles for the tipi than as vanity furniture. So when you slept in a tipi, you slept on hides, not because people lacked imagination, but because the material reality of the landscape dictated it. Bison hides were abundant, strong, and portable. They served as covers for the lodge, as bedding, as clothing, and even as trade goods. Wood, by contrast, was limited. Lodgepole pine, ideal for tipi poles, was sourced from the Rocky Mountains, sometimes carried vast distances. Once cut, those poles were reused for years, carefully tended and valued. Imagine hauling that kind of wood halfway across the prairie just to whittle it into a bed frame. The elders would laugh you out of camp. And don't mistake scarcity for deprivation. Hides did the job better. They were flexible, insulating, and most importantly, didn't weigh half a ton when wet. A bed frame, even a simple one, would have added bulk and rigidity to a household designed to move. Every item in a tipi could be broken down, rolled up, and carried. A wooden bed would have been like strapping a wardrobe to a backpacking trip. Sure, it's possible, but you'd look like an idiot, and you'd probably die trying. Meanwhile, settlers who clung to their wooden comforts often paid the price. They insisted on bringing beds, chairs, and tables into environments where those objects fought the landscape rather than worked with it. Log cabins filled with furniture looked civilized. Yes, but they were drafty, smoky, and immovable. The plains laughed at civilization. The wind went straight through those cracks, while Tipis flexed and breathed with the storm. There's also the symbolic dimension. Hides weren't just practical. They were spiritual. Buffalo provided food, shelter, clothing, tools, the foundation of life. Sleeping in robes wasn't making do. It was lying inside the body of the animal that sustained you, wrapped in a relationship of reciprocity. Try getting that kind of meaning out of a squeaky pine bed frame from the local carpenter. And even when timber was available through trade or along rivers, it was used for tools, sleds, and occasionally ceremonial items, not furniture. The calculus was simple. Does it move? Does it matter? Does it keep us alive? Beds failed on every count. Hides passed with honors. Now, of course, once horses became common and canvas covers replaced hides in the 19th century, tipis grew larger. You might think, well, surely now's the time to sneak in a bed frame. But no, because the logic of portability and efficiency never changed. The tipi's architecture, its airflow, and its social organization all demanded bedding that could roll and shift, not furniture that squatted in the way. The materials just reinforced the point. Hides worked with the land, would fought it. So when you stretch out on your buffalo robes, don't imagine you're lacking a bed. Imagine you're lying in the most logical, material-savvy choice for a treeless prairie. Beds belonged to forests and permanence. Hides belonged to grasslands and movement. And once you see it that way, even the fire itself takes on new meaning. Not just warmth, but part of the safety system that bedding on the ground made possible. Now, let's talk about the fire, the glowing center of your lodge, and the reason you didn't freeze into an ice sculpture by February. Fire was warmth, food, light, ritual, but fire also meant smoke, sparks, and the occasional ember landing somewhere you really didn't want it. And here's the crucial detail. The tipi was designed around this reality, while your fantasy of a raised bed frame would have turned it into a hazard waiting to happen. Start with ventilation. You've got a blaze going in the middle of the floor, smoke rising up, curling along the poles, and drifting out through the flaps. But it's not as simple as up and away. Drafts had to be managed. The liner created a low-pressure channel, pulling air in from below, feeding the fire, and directing smoke upward. Your sleeping zone, tucked behind that liner, was deliberately placed out of the smoke's path. Low, ground-level bedding meant you were breathing the cleanest, warmest air available. You could call that primitive, or you could admit it was a better ventilation system than many 19th century cabins, where smoke just clung to the rafters until everyone had a cough that sounded like a dying accordion. Now add sparks. A fire that burns all night will occasionally spit out glowing embers on hides and mats. They might smolder, maybe singe, on a wooden bed frame stuffed with straw ticks. Congratulations, you've built the prairie's first bonfire mattress. Low bedding meant less fuel in the fire's strike zone and faster reaction if something landed where it shouldn't. You didn't need a fire extinguisher. You had sense enough not to build kindling into your furniture. And let's not forget safety and movement. The tipi interior was a high-traffic zone. People circled the fire, entered through the low door, carried food, tended to children. At night, if you needed to stoke the fire or step outside, the last thing you wanted was to trip over furniture legs jutting into the path. Roll-up bedding hugged the edges neatly, keeping the central space open. Beds, by contrast, would have been like leaving coffee tables in a dark hallway, guaranteed bruises, or worse, a pot of soup appended onto someone's lap. Even the smoke itself had a purpose beyond irritation. Controlled smoke deterred insects, cured hides, and acted as a subtle disinfectant. Sleeping close to the ground meant you avoided the sting while still benefiting from the effects. Elevated sleeping would have left you gasping in the worst of it, your lungs becoming unintended smoke detectors, and you can't exactly press snooze on a respiratory emergency. So every choice, low bedding, open floor, strategic airflow, wasn't accidental. It was survival engineering. People knew the fire was both ally and threat, and they built their homes accordingly. They didn't just endure smoke. They managed it, tuned it, and worked with it. Imagine it this way. In a cabin, the fire was a stubborn guest that filled the room whether you liked it or not. In a tipi, fire was a choreographed partner in a dance of drafts and flaps, one you could nudge and guide, but never fully control. And sleeping low, along the ground, meant you were in the safest, healthiest position in that whole performance. So yes, the absence of beds wasn't about deprivation. It was about making sure you didn't choke, burn, or trip yourself into disaster. And once you understand that, you can see how even the way people arranged themselves around the fire wasn't random. It was social architecture sleeping as choreography, with every person's place shaping not just safety, but hierarchy. So you've survived the smoke, dodged the sparks, and curled into your buffalo robes. But here's the thing, in a tipi, you weren't just plopping down wherever you felt like it. This wasn't a sleepover where everyone scrambled for the softest couch cushion. No, sleeping arrangements were a map of society, drawn in hides and firelight. Where you laid your head told everyone exactly who you were. The fire burned in the middle, the heartbeat of the lodge, and everything radiated from it. Along the walls, bedding and belongings were placed in a pattern that wasn't casual. Family roles and kinship determined who slept where. Parents here, children there, guests assigned spots according to rank and relationship. The east-facing door opened with the sunrise, and that too carried weight. Some societies placed honored guests opposite the door so they'd be the first to catch the light. Others kept the position for household heads. Sleeping was never just biological downtime, it was social choreography. And think about it, lying in a circle meant you were always in sight of everyone else. Privacy, forget it. Every sneeze, every midnight shuffle, every whispered word was public knowledge. That might sound suffocating to you, but it also created a constant undercurrent of accountability. You knew your role in the circle, and you embodied it even while half asleep. A raised bed, a separate bedroom, would have shattered that intimacy, turning sleep into isolation instead of community. The circle also reinforced hierarchy subtly. Children often slept closer to the door, partly because it was colder, partly because it was the spot least central to ritual. Elders and heads of family held the more protected positions near the back, warmer, shielded, and central to household order. Guests weren't simply accommodated, they were placed in a spot that declared their standing. Imagine being invited into a tipi and realizing your sleeping spot silently announced how much, or how little, respect you had. No speeches needed, just bedding placement. And yet, this wasn't only about hierarchy, it was about safety. Arranged around the fire, each person's body became part of the lodge's balance. Children close to parents, supplies near the edges, tools within reach. Even in sleep, the lodge was organized for function. Who would tend the fire if it dwindled? Who would guard the entrance if danger approached? Who would stir first in the morning? Beds, with their bulky frames and rigid positions, would have disrupted that arrangement. A social map doesn't work if you start tossing furniture into the circle. Now imagine lying there, night after night, fire crackling, the walls breathing smoke and warmth, the sounds of your family all around breathing, shifting, murmuring in sleep. You're not alone, not separated by walls or frames. You're part of a ring that reinforces belonging and order. The tipi wasn't a house filled with bedrooms. It was one room that contained a world. And that's what makes it so easy to misunderstand today. To modernize, the lack of furniture looks like a lack of civilization. But in reality, it was civilization distilled every space, choreographed, every place meaningful, every choice functional. Sleep wasn't individual, it was communal. Of course, not every plains group lived in Tipis, and not every native household handled sleep this way. That contrasts the way plains societies prioritized flexibility versus how others built longhouses or grass. Lodges makes the tipi stand out all the more, which brings us to the wider plains diversity, and the way sleeping on the ground wasn't universal, but adapted to a specific way of life. By now, you might be thinking Tipis were the one-size-fits-all solution to Native American housing. Spoiler, they weren't. The tipi was perfect for the nomadic plains. But if you'd wandered even a few hundred miles into a different ecology, you'd have seen sleeping arrangements that looked nothing like hides rolled on a dirt floor. That's the first myth to torch. There was no single Native American way to sleep. Take the Iroquois and other Haudenosaunee peoples in the woodlands of the Northeast. They lived in longhouses, massive bark-clad structures, housing multiple families, sometimes dozens of people under one roof. There, sleep meant raised wooden platforms lined along the walls, mats and furs on top, personal belongings stored underneath. It looked more like bunking in a barracks than curling up in a tipi circle. Different environment, different materials, different solution. Head south and west, and you'd find pueblos in the desert, stacked masonry homes with flat roofs. People often slept on those rooftops in summer, under open skies, because the stone walls held heat like ovens during the day. Still further south, in the southeast, there were thatched houses with packed earth floors. Ventilation mattered more than portability. In short, housing adapted to place, and so did sleep. Beds as we picture them were rare, but platforms, mats, hides, and rooftops all had their place, dictated by ecology. So why did the tipi dominate the plains in particular? Because nothing else worked. Try building a longhouse where there are no trees tall enough to provide beams. Try living in a pueblo on a grassland where every horizon looks the same and storms roll in without warning. The plains demanded mobility and aerodynamic survival, and the tipi answered. But even within the plains, there were variations. Some groups, especially semi-sedentary agricultural peoples, along river valleys built earth lodges, domed structures of packed soil over wooden frames, semi-permanent and warm in winter. Inside, sleeping was often on raised platforms, similar to lodge houses. Meanwhile, nomadic groups followed the herds, rolling up hides into tipis, bedding down on the ground, and moving when the bison moved. Different strategies, same underlying goal: adapt the architecture to the ecology. Here's the funny thing: settlers often looked at tipis and sneered at their primitive design, while praising their own cabins as advanced. Yet many of those same settlers abandoned cabins to spend nights in tipis when storms proved too much. Some even wrote about the strange comfort of sleeping low, wrapped in hides, inside a structure that didn't leak like their nailed planks did. Civilization, it turned out, wasn't measured by whether you had a bed frame. It was measured by whether you froze to death. So, imagine yourself born into one of these cultures. If it's the plains, you're on the ground in hides, inside a breathing cone. If it's the northeast, you're on a raised platform inside a bark-clad hall. If it's the desert southwest, maybe you're stretched out on a rooftop, counting stars until you drift off. None of these people thought they were missing furniture. They thought they were sleeping exactly the way the land required. And that land, the brutal plains in particular, had one more trick. The tipi wasn't just about surviving wind and cold. It was also a shockingly stable shelter against weather extremes, with the ground itself becoming part of the insulation system. Which brings us right back to durability. How these lodges kept people safe, even when the environment tried to tear them apart. If you've ever pitched a flimsy nylon tent and watched it fold like a paper crane in a stiff breeze, you'll understand why the plains demanded something sturdier. The tipi wasn't a casual shelter, it was a storm-tested machine. You, bedding down on hides, weren't just trusting the ground, you were trusting a conical fortress designed to shrug off the moods of a continent. Let's start with wind. The plains didn't deal in polite breezes, they dealt in gales that could push a horse sideways. Flat-walled cabins and canvas tents fought that wind and usually lost. The tipi's cone, by contrast, didn't resist, it deflected. The wind slipped around it. Snow piled neatly down its sides instead of caving it in, and the staked hem kept the whole structure tethered like a ship anchored against a storm. Beds, raised and rigid, would have been liabilities, vibrating with every gust, while their owners cursed the gods. Sleeping low, against the wall, meant you were in the calmest pocket, insulated by hides and snowdrift alike. Rain, same story. Properly pitched, the cover sloped steep enough that water rolled down and away. The liner inside caught drips and directed them to the base, while the ozone overhead prevented the dreaded midnight splash onto your forehead. A wooden cabin might have shingles, yes, but cracks and warping let water creep in, soaking bedding and warping floors. In a tipi, you woke up dry not because rain didn't fall, but because centuries of design said it wouldn't fall on you. And snow was where the tipi shined. Settlers feared snow piling up against their cabins, collapsing roofs and blocking chimneys. Tipis, they used snow as insulation. Packed against the lower walls, it sealed out drafts and stabilized temperatures inside. The lodge breathed through its smoke hole, hearth steady, while the world outside froze in silence. You, tucked into your robe pile, might have been warmer than the settler wrapped in quilts beside his smoking iron stove. There are journals describing families in cabins, literally frostbitten indoors, while native families in Tipis slept comfortably just yards away. Efficiency isn't always about walls, it's about design. Even heat waves couldn't break the tipi. Those same flaps that vented smoke in winter opened wide in summer, releasing hot air and pulling in breezes at the base. Beds would have put you smack in the hottest zone, raised above the cooling draft. Sleeping on the ground, however, meant you stayed in the Earth's cool pocket, with airflow circulating just right. In other words, the tipi doubled as both furnace and air conditioner, all powered by wind and fire, no monthly bills attached. The durability wasn't only physical, light was psychological. Knowing your home wouldn't betray you in a storm meant rest was possible. You didn't spend every night wondering if the roof would cave in. You trusted the design, trusted the women who pitched it, trusted the generations who refined it. That trust made the difference between sleeping and merely enduring. So, as you curl into your buffalo robes and hear the wind clawing at the walls, remember, you're not surviving despite the tipi. You're surviving because of it. Beds might creak and sway, roofs might collapse, but this cone of poles and hides laughs at the storm. And that resilience wasn't just practical, it was part of the philosophy of life on the plains. Because here, the ground itself wasn't just where you slept. It was the only logical place to build a relationship with survival. Which brings us to the final point. Why, after all this, the ground was never seen as a downgrade. It was the bed, the design, the survival system itself. So here we are, at the end of your imagined plains day. You've eaten bison, maybe tightened the stakes against the evening wind, and now you're ready to sleep. No mattress store delivery, no squeaky bed frame, no decorative throw pillows arranged for guests you don't even like. Just the ground, hides, fire, and the quiet rhythm of a circle. And that wasn't second best, it was the design. The dirt floor wasn't a floor to be corrected with furniture, was the foundation of the tipi's physics. Low bedding meant you were in the thermal pocket, breathing warm, clean air, protected from drafts and sparks. It meant your bedroom wasn't an isolated cell, but part of a breathing system where earth, fire, and wind all played roles. A bed frame would have broken that balance like a bad note in a song. You don't add a piano to a drum circle and expect harmony. You don't add a bed to a tipi and expect comfort. And culturally, the ground wasn't humiliating, it was natural. You lay where the earth steadied you, where hides cushioned you, where the same soil held the fire that kept you alive. Settlers might have scoffed, calling it primitive, but their own homes left them coughing smoke and freezing in drafts. Meanwhile, tipi dwellers woke up warm, rested, and ready to move at dawn. Who exactly was primitive there? The ones rolling their beds across open prairie like stage props, or the ones who had streamlined survival into a design you could dismantle before breakfast. Even the psychology of it mattered. Sleeping low, side by side, in a circle, reinforced the communal bond. You weren't a solitary sleeper, locked away in a box of walls. You were part of a living system, every person placed in relation to the hearth, the door, the community. Your bed wasn't private property. It was a role in the circle, proof that you belonged. Beds isolate, the ground connected, and perhaps the most poetic part, sleeping on the ground linked you directly to the land itself. Every night, you pressed against the same earth that fed the bison, grew the grass, and anchored the poles. It wasn't about conquering the land with furniture, it was about aligning with it. Your body, wrapped in robes, lay where the soil released its stored warmth, where the Tipis design amplified what the earth already offered. That intimacy with the ground wasn't an absence of progress. It was a refusal to waste energy fighting what already worked. So the bottom line, you didn't sleep without a bed. You slept within a system. The fire, the liner, the smoke flaps, the circle of family, the robes of buffalo, and the earth itself. That was your bed. A living, breathing architecture of survival and belonging. Beds, as we think of them today, weren't just unnecessary, they were absurd. So tonight, if you're lying on your memory foam, staring at the ceiling, wondering why you still don't feel rested, think of this. You could have been lying on buffalo hides, warmed by a fire, inside a cone of poles tuned to the wind, surrounded by a circle of family, the earth itself holding you up. Primitive? No. Efficient, elegant, and unbothered by the idea of box springs. And with that, the circle of the tipi closes, and you're left with the one truth settlers never understood. The ground wasn't the absence of comfort, it was the invention of it. Long before thread, needles, and the romantic promise of linen sheets, there were hides sliced off the backs of animals with stone tools and turned into insulation by sheer necessity. Archaeologists love to show off the awls and scrapers from the Upper Paleolithic, those tiny bits of bone and flint that speak louder than 1,000 lectures. People weren't just killing animals for meat, they were processing skins for survival. The evidence is almost rude in its bluntness. Caves in Europe and Siberia hold microscopic traces of worked hides, while frozen burials, like those in the Altai or Siberian permafrost, reveal fur garments that could still pass for luxury winter coats. The message is clear. Without skins, the story of human endurance in the Ice Age would have ended with a very short epilogue. The first roll of hides wasn't glamorous. They were crude barriers against cold winds, damp earth, and the unrelenting chill of nights that could freeze bone marrow. But already, there's a kind of genius in the simplicity. A strip of fur was clothing by day, bedding by night, a makeshift roof in a sudden storm. The line between coat and blanket didn't exist because it didn't need to. If warmth came from wrapping a bloody hide around your body, so be it. Hygiene was a problem for later epochs. Frostbite was the more pressing threat. Evidence suggests that animal skins were used as flooring in early shelters. Lining the ground with hides wasn't about luxury, it was about creating a barrier between fragile human skin and the unforgiving earth. Heat loss through direct contact with frozen ground can be deadly, and prehistoric people knew this instinctively. So they laid down hides in caves and huts, then piled themselves and their kin on top. The earliest human beds were really communal heaps, animal skin pressed to human skin, with the occasional flea making its contribution to early epidemiology. What's striking is that this wasn't just improvisation, it was systematic. Tanning methods using fat, brains, or smoke already appear in the archaeological record tens of thousands of years ago. These weren't amateurs. Processing hides required labor, skill, and an understanding of how to make stiff, bloody flesh pliable and durable. Brain-tanned leather, softened by emulsified fats and repetitive stretching, could last for years, and it's no accident that nearly every hunting society across the globe stumbled onto some version of the same trick. If you've got an animal, you've got enough raw materials to make both dinner and bedding. Efficient, a little grotesque, and completely necessary. And while stone points in cave paintings get all the press, hides were the quiet backbone of survival. A spear might kill a mammoth, but it was the hide that let you sleep that night without shivering to death. Clothing and shelter leave fewer dramatic ruins, Yet without them, all the cave art in the world would have been produced by corpses. It's a bitter irony. The objects that kept humanity alive were the ones designed to decay. The earliest evidence of hides and fur use isn't just about practical warmth. It also tells us something darker, something about intimacy with animals that went beyond meat. To live, people wore skins, slept in them, and breathed through them. The smell of smoke-cured hide, the oily tang of fat rubbed into leather, the damp musk of fur in melting snow, these weren't accessories. They were the atmosphere of human existence. Warmth wasn't an invention. It was borrowed, night after night, from the bodies of other creatures. And once hides had been stitched, softened, and spread across the ground, their role shifted from personal insulation to something bigger, the shared nest, where families and groups huddled together in collective warmth. The boundary between what was worn and what was slept on didn't exist for much of human history. A skin that served as a cloak by day was unrolled on the ground by night, doubling as bedding without complaint. The same hide that protected from wind while hunting also cushioned the spine against hard soil. Efficiency wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was the only way to get through a winter that stretched half the year and showed no mercy. Buffalo on the plains, reindeer in the Arctic, seals along the coasts, sheep in the highlands, each species offered not just calories, but continuity of warmth long after the flesh was stripped away. A buffalo robe could be draped across shoulders for travel, and then layered with others inside a tipi to build a nest deep enough to laugh at the blizzard outside. Among the Sami, reindeer hides lined sleds by day and served as bedding by night. The hollow hairs trapping heat better than most modern textiles could dream of. Inuit families prized caribou hides for the same reason, layering them with fur side in, fur side out, until insulation was complete. One animal provided both motion and rest, both survival during the chase and comfort afterward. What makes the dual role striking is how obvious it seems once spelled out. If every object must be carried, if every pound matters, why would anyone distinguish sharply between garment and blanket? A skin was warmth in any configuration. The body was the hinge. Drape it upright and you had clothing. Spread it flat and you had bedding. The interchangeability was part of the genius. This wasn't crude improvisation either. Archaeological finds show hides cut to specific shapes, sewn with sinew, softened with brains and smoke to increase durability. The same techniques that produced winter parkas produced bedding thick enough to sleep whole families. The hides absorbed the smell of fire, of bodies, of nights spent in caves or lodges. They became biographies in leather, each crease and stain a record of both animal life and human survival. And these skins weren't just private property, they circulated. A well-tanned robe might be gifted, traded, or displayed in ritual. Buffalo hides, painted with scenes of hunts or battles, served as storytelling canvases as well as bedding. A caribou skin blanket was more than a cover. It was a portable inheritance, passed down or exchanged to cement relationships. Warmth wasn't only practical, it was social currency. What modern ears might find disquieting is how seamless this intimacy with animal remains really was. You didn't just eat the creature and wear it too, also lay down on it at night, face pressed into its fur, relying on it for comfort long after it had ceased breathing. Sleep itself was mediated through the bodies of animals, as if humanity could never escape the reminder that survival came from their death. To rest meant to borrow the heat of another being, to let their hollow hairs and softened hides become a second skin. And as nights turned into seasons, the collective act of lying down together, covered by hides, blurred the line between individual and group. Clothing had been about the self, but bedding layered and shared was about the collective. Which is why, once skins moved from clothing into bedding, they became the scaffolding for something larger, collective warmth. The practice of bodies and hides layered together until winter itself had no way in. The earth is merciless to the unprotected body. Lie on frozen soil, and the ground doesn't just chill. It drinks the heat out of you like a thirsty parasite. Early humans figured this out the hard way, and then responded with the simplest insulation possible. Animal skins between flesh and earth. Hides were never just blankets. They were barriers. They broke the cold chain, turned the hostile floor into a tolerable bed, and kept the body from surrendering its warmth back to the ground. Archaeological layers in caves often show traces of hides spread out as flooring, sometimes mixed with grasses, reeds, or moss. These makeshift beds were less about softness and more about survival physics. Heat loss from conduction is cruelly efficient, and without hides, the body became a leaking furnace. With hides, the leak slowed, and warmth collected in the human-animal nest. A family curled on the ground, draped in skins, wasn't being primitive. They were exploiting the thermal mass of Earth, while preventing it from stealing everything. The logic carried into nomadic shelters. In plains Tipis, buffalo robes were spread along the base, turning bare dirt into a surface that breathed with the lodge's airflow system. In the Arctic, reindeer hides were laid on snow itself, their hollow hairs creating a cushion of trapped air that insulated against the frozen crust. Even in temperate regions, hides shielded against dampness, the silent killer that crept in from soil. Dry skin against dry skin meant fewer chills, fewer infections, fewer nights spent shivering. Sleeping on the ground with skins also created a kind of intimacy with the landscape. Unlike raised beds, which impose a wooden barrier, hide bedding kept people close to the earth's rhythms, its coolness, its slight tremors, its smell of soil or snow. Night wasn't about separation but negotiation. Animal, human, and earth layered together in uneasy alliance. The irony is, sharp by lying low, people created more comfort than if they had elevated themselves. Higher wasn't better. Higher was colder, smokier, draftier, and hides made the ground adaptable. Spread thick, they cushioned. Folded double, they formed makeshift pillows. Arranged strategically, they could wall off cold drafts creeping under lodge walls. Portable, flexible, endlessly rearrangeable. They did what heavy furniture never could. They made every patch of ground potentially livable. A hide wasn't just something you slept under. It was what transformed soil into a bed, snow into a mattress, stone into a tolerable surface. This practice carried symbolic weight to go. To sleep on the ground inside hides was to acknowledge dependence on the animal killed, on the earth beneath, on the fire in the middle. It was a nightly reminder that human comfort was borrowed, never owned. Unlike a bed that pretends permanence, hides admitted fragility. Warmth existed only as long as the animal's skin and the collective body heat lasted. So the nightly ritual was less about lying alone on your bed and more about merging with the skins and the soil in a collective cocoon. And that sets the stage for the next step, the one that makes human sleep anthropologically fascinating. The moment when bedding wasn't just individual protection, but collective strategy, where warmth wasn't kept to oneself, but shared across bodies. One body wrapped in hides was survival. Several bodies wrapped in hides together was insurance. Humans figured out early that warmth multiplied when shared, and so the practice of collective sleeping emerged not as sentiment, but as mathematics. Layer skins beneath, throw more over the top, then pack bodies close enough that the air trapped between them turns into insulation. The family bed wasn't invented by Victorian morality. It was a Paleolithic survival mechanism. Accounts from Arctic ethnographies describe families pressed together beneath caribou skins, children wedged between parents to absorb warmth from both sides. The Sami called it practical, not affectionate. Inuit families knew that body heat, combined with the loft of hollow hairs, could keep interior temperatures livable even in sub-zero storms. Among plains peoples, buffalo robes draped over multiple sleepers created nests so warm that snowstorms outside the tipi sounded more like theater than threat. It was efficiency disguised as intimacy. The act had consequences beyond temperature. Sleeping collectively blurred the line between personal space and communal body. Privacy didn't exist when elbows, breath, and dreams mingled in the same cocoon. Children learned their place in the social fabric, not by words, but by where they were laid down at night. Grandparents against the inner wall, parents flanking the fire, children clustered like kindling. In between it was hierarchy mapped in hides. This arrangement also bred trust, or at least constant negotiation of it. To sleep that close meant surrendering to vulnerability in the presence of others. One restless limb, one ill-timed cough, and the entire cocoon stirred. Yet the system reinforced cooperation. Survival demanded tolerance, and warmth was the nightly dividend. It's no coincidence that societies who relied on collective warmth emphasized kinship bonds so strongly. Every night, those bonds were tested and renewed in the glow of the hearth. The irony, of course, is that modern notions of romantic shared beds are pale imitations of this older logic. Sleeping together was rarely about intimacy in the sentimental sense. It was about ensuring that nobody froze. Husbands, wives, children, grandparents, and sometimes even guests all contributed to the thermal economy. Warmth wasn't hoarded. It was redistributed by proximity, and the hides themselves reinforced this collectivity. One person under a buffalo robe was warmer than nothing. Several people under the same robe created a microclimate. Heat radiated, trapped, recycled. The animal's body, now transformed into hide, extended its protective function to multiple human bodies at once. The robe became both wall and blanket, linking everyone inside the same thermal envelope. Yet collective warmth wasn't purely physical. It also shaped rhythm and ritual. Stories were told under hides before sleep. Children drifted off to the sound of breath and fire crackle. Elders whispered lessons no one could pretend not to hear. Warmth encouraged closeness. Closeness encouraged transmission. Knowledge, like heat, spread more easily when bodies pressed together. So hides didn't just preserve individuals. They preserved communities. They made possible the continuity of group life through winter, when separation meant weakness and closeness meant survival. But even within that shared logic, specific regions developed skins best suited to their climates: reindeer in the north, buffalo on the plains, seal in the Arctic. And that's where the story takes a sharper focus into the case studies where collective warmth was honed to perfection. In the Arctic, warmth wasn't a luxury. It was the thin line between life and immediate extinction. Caribou and reindeer provided more than food. They were portable central heating systems disguised as hides. Inuit, Yupik, and Sami groups didn't need abstract theories of thermodynamics. They had hollow-haired skins that trapped air so effectively you could sleep on snow and still wake up with a pulse. Caribou hides were prized above almost all others. Their hairs, lightweight and hollow, acted like millions of tiny thermos flasks, storing heat instead of letting it escape. A double layer fur side in, fur side out could insulate a sleeping body better than most modern synthetic bags. In ethnographic accounts, Inuit families nested together beneath these hides. Children pressed into the center like burning coals in a hearth. The hides didn't just cover, they transformed the igloo or snow shelter into a living nest. Without them, the warm breath of several bodies would condense into frost and freeze skin by morning. With them, even temperatures well below zero became tolerable. The Sami, living in northern Scandinavia, used reindeer in much the same way. Inside the lavvu, their conical tent, reindeer hides covered the ground, preventing heat loss into frozen soil, while more hides piled on top of sleepers. Sleds were lined with them too. No one wanted to sit on bare wood when traversing tundra. Archaeological finds show that the hides were treated, dried, and carefully rotated to preserve loft and effectiveness. Reindeer weren't just resources, they were survival partners. Sealskins played their part along the coasts. Sturdier and less insulating than caribou, they excelled at waterproofing. People could sleep wrapped in them while traveling by kayak or while resting on damp sea ice. The sealskin outer layer combined with caribou inner robes created the Arctic equivalent of a layered sleeping system, optimized centuries before outdoor gear companies patented the idea. And this wasn't just utilitarian. Skins carried symbolic and spiritual weight. Among Inuit, animals were understood as giving themselves to humans, and proper respect had to be shown in how hides were used. To mistreat a skin was to risk offending the animal's spirit, jeopardizing future hunts. Every night of warmth came with a reminder. Survival depended on maintaining good relations with the animals who quite literally became bedding. Collective warmth under these hides created an intimacy sharpened by extremity. In an igloo, space was small. Light came only from a seal oil lamp, and all bodies were pressed close beneath robes. Breath condensed on fur, hands brushed in the dark, dreams mingled with snores. Privacy was unthinkable, but survival was guaranteed. The hide wasn't just insulation, it was contract, memory, and boundary all at once. So when outsiders later arrived with wool blankets or wooden beds, they often failed spectacularly. Beds raised sleepers into colder air, while wool couldn't match the loft of caribou. Indigenous Arctic systems remained stubbornly better, tailored perfectly to their ecology. It's one of anthropology's enduring lessons. Technology is only primitive until you measure its efficiency against the environment it was built for. From here, the Arctic teaches the principle clearly. Hides weren't optional, they were the infrastructure of life. And that same logic echoed further south, where vast grasslands and bison herds shaped a different, but equally ingenious, skin-based system of survival and collective warmth. On the Great Plains, warmth came with horns and hooves. The bison wasn't just inert, it was the mattress, blanket, and insulation department rolled into one enormous animal. A single robe might weigh 50 pounds, thick enough to block wind, supple enough to fold, and warm enough to keep a sleeper alive on nights when the prairie wind could freeze water in a bucket indoors. Archaeologists and ethnographies agree, without buffalo hides, the plains lifestyle simply would not have worked. Tipis depended on them. Covers were stitched from multiple hides, sometimes more than a dozen, each scraped, smoked, and softened with animal brains. But inside was where hides became intimate. Buffalo robes lined the ground, transforming bare soil into a sleeping surface. Families spread them edge to edge, layered them, then wrapped themselves in more robes at night. A bed wasn't an object you built, it was an arrangement of skins. When Europeans wrote with faint disdain that native lodges lacked furniture, they missed the point. Why drag wood across treeless prairie when one animal provided everything? The collective warmth system was elegant. Several people might share a single large robe, or multiple robes layered together. Heat radiated inward, trapped by the heavy hides, and turned into a microclimate that defied the blizzards outside. Buffalo hair, with its dense undercoat, was particularly effective at holding heat. Accounts describe winter camps where snow piled high against the tippy walls while families inside lay comfortable, lulled by firelight, wrapped in buffalo. It wasn't luxury, it was survival strategy at its most efficient. Robes also carried status. A beautifully tanned hide, softened to velvety pliability, could be traded, gifted, or painted. Painted buffalo hides recorded battles, hunts, or visions, turning blankets into historical documents. A robe spread on the ground might bear the record of a warrior's deeds or a shaman's dream. And yet at night it still doubled as bedding. Symbolism and practicality never separated. They layered like the hides themselves, and like in the Arctic, collective warmth reshaped social life. In the tipi, family members slept arranged around the fire, each with a role in the circle. Elders in the warmer back, children closer to the door, parents flanking. Buffalo hides weren't just passive bedding, they enforced proximity, pressed bodies into nightly communion. A robe, large enough to cover multiple sleepers, encouraged cooperation. If one shifted, all shifted. Heat wasn't individual, it was communal property. It also explains why furniture never caught on. Beds would have been ridiculous here. Heavy, rigid, immovable. Buffalo robes, in contrast, folded up, strapped to a travois, and traveled with the herd. They carried warmth across miles as easily as they carried stories. To lie down at night in buffalo hides was to acknowledge both dependence and mobility were alive because the animals moved, and so did you. Outsiders often described plains sleeping habits as primitive, yet many a trader or soldier ended up envying the comfort. Wooden bunks creaked, blankets mildewed, but a buffalo robe delivered warmth without complaint. Primitive is just another word people use when they don't understand efficiency. And when the herds were wiped out in the 19th century, it wasn't just food that disappeared. It was warmth, architecture, bedding, and the entire thermal system of the plains. Which makes the comparison sharper still when we turn to other grassland cultures across the steppe in Central Asia who solved the same problem with their own layering of skins and collective sleep. Across the great Eurasian steppe, the formula looked familiar: wind that never stops, winters that don't forgive, and a horizon so wide it leaves no trees to hide behind. The solution wasn't buffalo this time, but herds of sheep, goats, horses, and camels, animals that fed, clothed, and literally cushioned the people who followed them. Collective warmth here didn't just mean bodies pressed together under hides. It meant entire households sleeping on layered skins and felts inside yurts, the portable roundhouses that dotted Mongolia, Central Asia, and beyond. A yurt wasn't bare dirt underfoot. Floors were covered with felt mats, compressed wool made from flocks that grazed the same endless grass. Over those mats came animal skins, thick and soft, creating insulation between sleepers and the icy ground. Families lay close, piled with blankets of sheepskin or goat hides, warmth radiating outwards and trapped beneath layers of felt. The design was clever. The round walls held heat, the central hearth fed it, and the skins made sure it didn't escape into the earth. The steppe wind might roar like a beast outside, but inside the yurt was a cocoon. Horses and camels weren't left out of the equation. Horsehair was woven into ropes and mats, camel hides into coverings. Camel hair blankets, prized for their loft and strength, were laid over groups of sleepers, turning the animal into a nightly guardian against frost. And because pastoral life meant mobility, hides and felts were designed to be rolled, strapped, and reassembled at the next camp. Nothing heavy, nothing fixed, nothing that couldn't be carried with the herds. What makes the steppe unique is how collective warmth extended beyond families to entire encampments. Yurts clustered together, often with doors facing the same direction, shared heat psychologically, if not physically. Inside, however, the logic was the same as the plains or Arctic. Pile hides, pile bodies, trust the animals to keep you alive long after their deaths. The skins themselves carried cultural weight. A finely tanned sheepskin, soft and white, might be reserved for guests, signaling honor. Felt mats dyed with geometric patterns weren't only practical, they declared identity, lineage, artistry. Sleeping together meant lying literally on top of the history and wealth of your herd. Comfort doubled as symbolism. Anthropologists note that even the social order was marked by sleeping placement inside the yurt. Elders and household heads occupied the honored spots near the rear, while younger members clustered closer to the door. Guests were positioned carefully, their bedding layered with skins chosen to communicate respect. A night's sleep wasn't just rest, it was a ritual choreography of hierarchy, intimacy, and diplomacy. The collective warmth of the steppe world had another layer. Song, story, and ritual passed along the mats. Nomadic nights were filled with oral epics, whispered myths, and chants that carried across shared blankets. Heat and narrative were distributed in the same akbadis, huddled close, ears catching the rhythm of words. Warmth wasn't only physical insulation, it was cultural continuity. So from sheep in felt mats to camels in woven blankets, the pastoral steppe followed the same truth seen in the Arctic and plains. Animals made survival possible not once, but twice, first in life, then in warmth after death. And from here, the story bends toward the more intimate details. How hides weren't just insulation, but agents of health, hygiene, and the shaping of nightly bonds. Sleeping in animal skins wasn't just about staying alive, it was about how well you stayed alive. A hide on the ground wasn't glamorous, but it stopped frostbite from creeping into toes and damp chills from gnawing at lungs. Without that barrier, you didn't just wake up stiff. You risked pneumonia, fevers, or the kind of coughs that ended lineages. Archaeological evidence of smoke-tanned hides and ethnographic records of buffalo robes, reindeer furs, and seal skins all point to the same blunt reality. Health was preserved nightly through the smell of animal fat and the scratch of fur against skin. The hygiene part is less poetic. Hides weren't sterile, sheets pulled fresh from a laundry line. They carried oils, smoke, the musk of animals, and occasionally insects. But that trade-off was calculated. A few fleas could be tolerated. A night spent without insulation could kill. Many cultures smoked hides deliberately, not just to preserve them but to deter pests and add a faint antiseptic quality. The result was a bedding system that smelled like campfire and marrow, but kept bodies warm enough to see another dawn. Collective warmth amplified these effects. Bodies pressed together in the cocoon of hides reduced individual energy loss, meaning people could survive longer on fewer calories. In cold climates, this mattered enormously. The less heat you lost at night, the less food you needed to burn by day. Entire groups became more resilient because skins and shared sleeping cut metabolic costs. Health was engineered communally, not individually. But the hides did more than protect against cold. They defined how people related. To share a skin was to share vulnerability. You smelled each other's breath, felt each other's movements, overheard dreams muttered in sleep. Bonds weren't abstract, they were forged in proximity, under a hide that forced bodies into the same climate. Parents wrapped children between them, grandparents tucked at the warmer ends, siblings wedged wherever they fit. Guests entered this intimate economy carefully, assigned hides that signaled trust or distance. A sleeping arrangement was a social contract, soft and fur-lined, but serious nonetheless. These bonds extended beyond the immediate family. Plains peoples often used buffalo hides painted with stories, turning bedding into memory palimpsests. A child falling asleep on such a robe absorbed both warmth and history, staring at painted hunts or cosmological figures until dreams carried them away. In the Arctic, the shared sleeping platform inside an igloo made gossip, songs, and whispered instructions unavoidably. Everyone heard everything, for better or worse. Skins turned the act of resting into a nightly seminar in belonging. The irony is sharp when compared to modern notions of cleanliness and personal space. Today, the idea of crawling into bed with grandparents, cousins, and guests under the same cover would spark protest. Yet for thousands of years, that arrangement meant survival, stronger immune systems, and tighter social bonds. Warmth wasn't privatized, it was pooled, and in pooling it, people built networks of obligation, care, and cooperation. So hides weren't just insulation. They were tools of health management and instruments of intimacy. They kept the body alive and the group cohesive, shaping the rhythms of trust and tolerance. And yet, as agricultural societies expanded and textiles spread, this nightly animal intimacy began to decline. The transition to woven bedding marked not just a technological shift, but a cultural one, away from skins, toward cloth, and away from collective warmth, toward individual sleep. The slow retreat of animal skins from nightly life wasn't because they stopped working. They were still warm, still portable, still durable. What changed was the loom. As agriculture spread and settled villages replaced seasonal camps, fibers began to matter more than hides. Flax, cotton, hemp, and later wool from domesticated sheep became the raw materials of bedding. Textiles could be woven, dyed, and washed, and unlike hides, they didn't carry the faint odor of smoke and blood. Beds began to smell less like animals and more like fields. The appeal was practical, but also social. A woven blanket didn't rot if neglected for a season. Cloth could be produced in bulk, traded across regions, and displayed as a marker of household wealth. The woven coverlet draped over a raised bed said something hides could not: permanence. In farming communities where homes didn't move, bedding could grow bulky. Animal skins, once prized for their portability, started to look like relics of nomadic pragmatism, but the decline wasn't immediate. Hides remained essential in harsher regions, layered beneath woven textiles, or kept as winter reserves. In medieval Europe, peasants still slept beneath sheepskins, long after elites wrapped themselves in linen sheets. In Asia, camel and yak hides were used alongside wool blankets in steppe camps. Even as textiles spread, the old system of animal warmth lingered, especially in places where winter laughed at thin woven cloth. What really eroded hide use was hygienate, least in perception. As notions of cleanliness shifted, particularly under urbanization, skins came to be associated with dirt and poverty. Cloth could be boiled, bleached, or perfumed. Hides clung to their smells. A buffalo robe was a treasure on the plains, but an embarrassment in a European bedroom. Warmth had become a class marker, and hides were losing status. The transition reshaped sleeping itself. As beds grew more elaborate frames, mattresses, feather-ticked people moved upward, away from the ground. Skins had linked sleepers to soil, fire, and one another. Cloth separated them, layering privacy into fabric. Collective warmth declined as well. Woven bedding was lighter, easier to individualize, easier to claim as mine. What had once been a shared cocoon of buffalo or reindeer became a patchwork of individual blankets tucked around single bodies. Sleep was turning private, domesticated, and ironically colder in spirit, if not in temperature. The symbolic shift is striking. Animal skins were once the center of survival, imbued with ritual respect. Caribou robes for the Arctic, buffalo hides for the plains, painted skins for ceremony. As they faded from nightly use, they survived mainly as symbols. Chiefs wore robes as regalia, shamans cloaked themselves in hides for rituals, communities kept them as heirlooms. The warmth remained, but only ceremonially. Bedding had been domesticated into cloth, and hides had been exiled to the domain of tradition. Yet the story isn't simply decline. the memory of hides lingered in language and culture. Phrases like wolf at the door or sleeping in sheep's clothing echo the intimacy once taken for granted. Even now, furs reappear in luxury fashion, as though the deep connection to animal warmth refuses to disappear entirely. Humans may have moved on to textiles, but the memory of lying skin to skin with the bodies of other creatures still haunts the cultural imagination. And this memory explains why hides never truly vanish. Even after the loom conquered the bed, skins remained in ritual, costume, and symbolism, ghosts of warmth preserved in new forms. Even after hides slipped from the nightly grind of bedding, they refused to leave human life entirely. Instead, they migrated into the symbolic realm, where warmth became memory and fur became metaphor. Skins that once lined the floor of shelters or wrapped around sleeping families reappeared in cloaks of power, ritual costumes, and sacred coverings. The intimacy with animal warmth didn't vanish, it was repackaged as heritage. Consider the ceremonial buffalo robes painted by plains peoples. By the 19th century, when bison herds had been decimated and textiles were common through trade, these hides were no longer simply bedding. They became canvases of history, covered with visions, hunts, and battles, worn in councils or displayed at gatherings. To wrap oneself in such a robe wasn't just to keep warm, it was to step into continuity, to declare connection with ancestors who had once relied on hides nightly for survival. The Arctic kept its echoes to caribou skins still lined sleds and were used in ritual settings, their hollow hairs symbolizing the animal's gift of endurance. Among the Sami, reindeer hides continued to play a role in ceremonies, even as wool and factory-made textiles spread. The warmth of the animal remained an honored presence, even when no longer necessary in every household. Elsewhere, skins entered religion. Priests in ancient Greece wore animal hides during sacrifice. Shamans from Siberia to North America clothed themselves in fur or feathers to signal transformation. The hide that once blocked frostbite now blocked the boundary between human and spirit. Animal warmth became a conduit to the sacred. To wear skin was to borrow not just physical protection, but also the animal's quality, strength, agility, fertility, resilience. This symbolic continuity also shows up in language and culture. To be in someone else's skin, to shed one's skin, to wear the lion's hide. These phrases still circulate, faint echoes of the era when sleeping inside animal skins was literal, not metaphorical. Modern beds with their sanitized linens might have severed the direct link, but the memory of warmth as borrowed animal life lingers stubbornly. And even in the supposedly civilized world of textile dominance, fur reappeared as luxury. Aristocrats in Europe swaddled themselves in sable and mink, kings draped in ermine, nobles in wolfskin. These weren't practical necessities anymore, they were symbols of wealth and control. The animal's warmth had been transformed into a sign of status, but the underlying truth was the same. To wear fur was to declare intimacy with something beyond the human body. It's almost ironic that in the modern age of synthetic fabrics and central heating, people still chase the feel of animal warmth. Faux fur blankets, sheepskin rugs, reindeer hides, sold in Scandinavian design shops, vestiges of the old survival system, domesticated into decor. The body may no longer need skins to survive, but the memory of that dependency still hums in culture like a low note, hard to erase. So, the story of hides and collective warmth doesn't end with textiles. It continues in painted robes, ritual costumes, idioms, luxury fashion, and nostalgia. Animal skins, once survival itself, now survive as symbols, proof that even when a practice vanishes, the warmth of its memory lingers. Long before sleep was explained with charts of brainwaves and REM cycles, it was treated as a suspicious disappearance. At night, people seemed to stop being themselves. The body stayed, but something essential, breath, awareness, soul, call it what you like, slipped out and wandered. Early humans didn't need philosophers to tell them this. The evidence was right there every morning. A sleeper woke with stories of traveling to places they hadn't walked, speaking with the dead, or watching events unfold miles away. If the body hadn't moved, then something else must have. Caves and ancient shelters carried traces of this logic. Paleolithic paintings often mix animals, humans, and half-human figures that look more like dream apparitions than straightforward hunting manuals. Some anthropologists argue these images record trance states, visions that blurred waking and sleeping. The sleeping body, after all, was the perfect laboratory for such strangeness. Eyes closed, limbs slack, but inside, a parade of images no one could control. For people trying to map the world, that parade had to mean something. Dreams weren't dismissed as mental noise, they were treated as messages. Who would waste a perfectly good hallucination when it might be advice from ancestors or a warning from spirits? A nightmare wasn't indigestion, it was a predator in disguise, an omen, a spiritual ambush. Pleasant dreams weren't entertainment, they were blessings, glimpses of abundance, reassurance that the invisible world still cared. The sleeper was both vulnerable and privileged, drifting nightly into a realm where meanings appeared uninvited. It didn't take long for societies to assume that dreams and sleep meant the soul was mobile. Many cultures developed the idea of a free soul, something that could detach, wander, and return at dawn. If a sleeper startled awake, breathless and shaken, it was explained as the soul snapping back into the body after being startled outside. If someone slept too deeply, relatives might murmur protective words or even guard the body, fearing the soul had strayed too far to return. Death itself was often described as a sleep that went on too long, the soul never finding its way home. The eeriness of sleep was sharpened by its regularity. Every night, people willingly surrendered consciousness, and every morning they woke unsure of what had happened to them in the meantime. If life was a fire to be tended carefully, sleep was like handing the flames to invisible strangers and hoping they didn't drop it. The reliance on ritual charms, whispered prayers, body positioning wasn't superstition so much as insurance against the risks of letting the soul drift. What mattered most was the conviction that sleep was porous. It wasn't just biological rest, but a nightly crossing into another territory, one where rules bent, ancestors lingered, and spirits prowled. Waking life was only half the story. The other half played out in the uncertain theater behind closed eyes, where memory, desire, and supernatural instruction braided together. And once people accepted that the soul wandered during sleep, the next question pressed in. Where exactly did it go? And what happened if it didn't come back? If the soul left the body during sleep, then it must have had somewhere to go. Many cultures filled in this blank with remarkable precision. The Malays described a wandering free soul that could drift from its sleeping host like smoke. The Ibon warned against waking someone abruptly for fear the soul might not find its way back. In Amazonian groups, the nightly departure was so accepted that dreams were treated as actual travels when someone described hunting far away or meeting a jaguar spirit. No one called it imagination. It was geography of a different kind, mapped not with rivers and mountains, but with visions and omens. This idea created a delicate problem. What if the soul didn't return? Suddenly, sleep wasn't just restorative, it was risky. Too deep a slumber, too abrupt an awakening, too strong a fright, and the soul might be lost, stolen, or delayed. Across Oceania, for instance, stories describe malevolent spirits snatching the wandering essence of a sleeper, leaving behind a body cold and unresponsive. Nightmares weren't dismissed as trifles. They were evidence of the soul under attack. To sleep was to step out unarmed into contested territory. Protective measures grew around this fear. In many places, amulets were placed by the bed, not to comfort but to guard. In Polynesia, tattoos served as spiritual signatures, so even if the soul wandered, spirits could recognize and return it. In Madagascar, children were shielded with whispered charms before being laid to rest, so their souls wouldn't be mistaken for prey by wandering forces. The act of putting someone to bed was less tucking in and more sending off a fragile traveler. The free soul theory also blurred the line between dreaming and spirit possession. Among the Ojibwe, dream catchers were developed not as quaint ornaments but as functional nets to filter hostile spirits from reaching the sleeper's traveling soul. In parts of West Africa, sleeping sickness caused by the tsetse fly was interpreted as the soul trapped outside, stolen by spirits who refused to let go. The boundary between medical crisis and spiritual kidnapping was thin, and in both cases, the body looked the same, still, unconscious, vulnerable. What's fascinating is how consistent this imagery became. Even without communication between continents, societies imagined sleep as an exodus, the body as an empty shell, the soul as a wanderer prone to mishap. The sleeping figure was always in danger of being caught between worlds. If the body was stirred too soon, the soul might not have time to settle back in. If the soul lingered too long, the body might stiffen into death. Sleep was practice for mortality, a rehearsal staged every night. And if souls could drift and encounter other beings while away, then what returned each morning carried more than rest. It carried information, visions, instructions, warnings. Dreams weren't scraps of nonsense. They were the baggage of the soul's nocturnal travels, which meant that sleep wasn't passive at all. It was an active journey, and like any journey, it mattered who or what was met along the way. From here, the leap was natural. If sleep carried the soul into other realms, then the dreams it brought back must be read like messages. And that conviction turned sleep into the earliest postal service between humans and the sacred. Once sleep was understood as a journey, dreams became its souvenirs, tokens from the places the soul had visited in the dark. They weren't dismissed as random flickers of the mind. They were sorted, weighed, and handled with the gravity of sacred correspondence. To dream was to receive mail from beyond, though the handwriting was often strange, and the return address rarely listed. Across indigenous North America, dreams were treated with the seriousness of prophecy. Among the Lakota, visions that came in sleep were believed to be instructions from spirits, often tied to a person's path in life. A child's dream might be discussed as a clue to their destiny, shaping what roles they'd take on in the community. The Iroquois went further, holding dream-sharing ceremonies where people recounted their nocturnal visions and the group tried to fulfill or interpret them. To ignore a dream was to court misfortune. To act on it was to stay aligned with the spirits. The pattern repeated far from the Americas. In Polynesian cultures, dreams could bring visits from ancestors who offered guidance or issued warnings. A dream of fishing wasn't simply about fish. It might mean abundance or danger, depending on which ancestor appeared with the net. To wake from such a dream was to wake with homework, often involving ritual or communal action. The dreamer wasn't a passive receiver, they were the chosen courier for a message meant to ripple through the group. Even in ancient civilizations, dreams were treated as official communication. Egyptian dream books catalogued symbols and their interpretations, turning the night into a bureaucratic office of omens. A dream of crocodiles might warn of enemies. A dream of bread could predict prosperity. The Greeks practiced dream incubation in temples, lying down in sacred chambers to solicit visions from gods like Asclepius. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was an appointment, a scheduled consultation with the divine. But dreams weren't always friendly memos. There could be threats, attacks, or manipulations. In parts of West Africa, bad dreams were taken as evidence of witchcraft. The soul ambushed by hostile forces. Among the Maori, nightmares could signify that one's spirit had been touched by tapu, or sacred danger, requiring immediate ritual cleansing. In these traditions, to wake sweating and shaken wasn't just unfortunate, it was a spiritual crisis with community-wide consequences. The idea that dreams carried authority explains why dream interpreters became powerful figures. Shamans, priests, and elders held the keys to decoding the strange metaphors of sleep. Their authority rested not on controlling the dreams themselves, but on convincing others that the tangled symbols could be translated into clear action. When entire societies believed grain harvests, wars, or marriages could be foretold in sleep, the interpreter's role was nothing short of political. Dreams, then, were never private. They were collective property, shared in ceremonies, used in planning, and treated as evidence of a world that spoke back to humans when their mouths were shut. And once communities accepted that dreams were messages, they began to design rituals that invited these messages, more directly turning sleep into something not accidental but cultivated, which is how temples, caves, and sacred beds became sites not just of rest, but of deliberate waiting for the sacred to whisper. Once dreams were treated as sacred messages, people stopped leaving them to chance. They began designing ways to coax the divine into their sleep, to turn night into a consultation service. Thus was born the practice of incubation, deliberately sleeping in a holy place, in the hope that spirits, ancestors, or gods would take the opportunity to scribble their advice across the dreamer's mind. The Greeks refined this into an art. At the temple of Asclepius, the god of healing, supplicants would fast, purify themselves, and lie down in special chambers. They weren't expecting rest, they were waiting for a dream diagnosis. If the god appeared and prescribed an offering or a ritual cure, the patient was considered treated. If nothing came, well, perhaps the god was busy, or the supplicant had snored too loudly. Either way, it was proof that health could be negotiated in sleep more effectively than in daylight. The Egyptians had their own traditions of dream incubation, stretching back to the New Kingdom. Inscriptions describe people sleeping near sacred statues, hoping for visions. Sometimes dreams were interpreted as direct orders: build this temple, plant that field, marry this person. Others were seen as medical prescriptions, complete with lists of dream symbols and their cures. The bed became an altar, and the act of closing one's eyes became an opening of channels. The Near East offered more variations. In Mesopotamia, kings and generals would sleep in temples before campaigns, hoping the gods would reveal the outcome of battles. The logic was simple: why gamble with lives when the dream world might reveal tomorrow's headlines? Clay tablets record dreams where divine figures handed over weapons, promises, or ominous warnings. If the king dreamt of victory, troops marched with confidence. If he dreamt of disaster, rituals were performed to shift fate, or in some cases, the dream was quietly reinterpreted until it sounded more favorable. What's striking is how physical these rituals were. Sleeping spaces were cleansed, beds ritually prepared, incense burned. People didn't just collapse into sleep. They staged it like theater, complete with props and scripts, so that the gods would be tempted to participate. Sleep was no longer passive. It was performance, divination disguised as slumber, and it wasn't limited to elites. In rural communities, people might sleep in caves, springs, or graveyards, places considered spiritually charged. Contact with ancestors, water spirits, or earth powers could be engineered by choosing the right bed for the night. The location mattered as much as the dream itself, as if the land itself whispered more loudly after dark. These rituals reveal how thin the border between sleep and prophecy had become. To drift off wasn't just to rest, it was to cross into a courtroom where gods issued decrees and ancestors offered unsolicited advice. Sleep was bureaucratic, sacred, and perilous all at once. And once shamans took this further, learning to mimic sleep states in waking trance, the link between sleeping and traveling to other worlds became even harder to untangle. Because if sleep could be cultivated into divination, then it could also be stretched into deliberate journeys beyond the body. If incubation turned sleep into a temple appointment, shamanism turned it into long-distance travel. The shaman didn't wait for dreams to arrive uninvited. They learned to step into them on command, blurring the line between sleep and trance. The body might slump, the eyes roll back, the breathing slow to something close to snoring, but inside, the mind was sprinting across spirit worlds like it had borrowed another species' legs. In Siberia, shamans were described as falling into deep, dreamlike states during rituals, their souls leaving the body to negotiate with spirits, ancestors, or animals. Outsiders often mistook it for unconsciousness, but to the community it was a kind of deliberate sleepwalking. The person halfway between living and not living, the drumbeat became a surrogate lullaby, lulling the body while waking the soul. Amazonian shamans did something similar with the help of plants. Ayahuasca, tobacco, didgeridoos weren't recreational experiments, but tools for engineering controlled dreaming. The visions resembled the same landscapes that came in night sleep. Animals that spoke, ancestors that gave warnings, hostile spirits that needed bargaining. The difference was that the shaman didn't wait for nightfall. They forced the journey in broad daylight, while their community looked on, waiting for news from beyond. The principle was consistent. Ordinary sleep already suggested that the soul could leave the body. Shamanism simply systematized it, learning how to open and close the door without losing the traveler. The shaman became an expert dreamer, a technician of altered states. When they returned, gasping or shivering, the community treated it as evidence, not of madness, but of successful exploration. Lucid dreaming, too, finds echoes here. In many traditions, shamans trained to recognize when they were dreaming, then manipulate the dream to gain knowledge or influence outcomes. The MROI spoke of Matakite, visionaries whose dreams pierced future events. In parts of North America, shamans used dreams to locate lost objects, game animals, or even missing people. It was all a matter of keeping the thread, knowing how to steer a soul in the fluid logic of dream geography. What made these practices both awe-inspiring and terrifying was the danger shamans risked not returning from their trance. Their bodies left comatose, their souls trapped in hostile territories. Communities describe shamans dying from battles fought in dreams, their deaths blamed not on earthly wounds but on injuries to the soul sustained while traveling. Sleep, already risky for ordinary people, became lethal when weaponized as ritual. The eerie part is how consistent the imagery remained. Whether in the Amazon, the Arctic, or Central Asia, the shaman's journey resembled sleep, eyes closed, body still, but consciousness slipping elsewhere. The performance reinforced what everyone already believed, that sleep was never just sleep, but an entrance to places one couldn't walk in daylight. And once whole communities began treating ordinary dreams as evidence and shamanic trances as travel, it made sense that even collective sleep could become ritualized, where groups shared and compared their nightly journeys. Because if one person's dream could change the course of a hunt, what might a whole camp's dreaming reveal? Sleep wasn't always a solitary business. In many communities, it became a collective act, a shared plunge into the dark, where bodies and spirits aligned. People didn't just lie down side by side for warmth, they did it to braid their nights together, to make dreaming a communal event. What one person saw in sleep could ripple across the whole group by morning. Among hunter-gatherer societies, dream sharing was routine. The Iroquois held councils where people recited their dreams, and the group worked to complete them. If someone dreamt of needing food, the community staged a symbolic feast. If another dreamt of a quarrel, reconciliation was sought in daylight. Dreams weren't private diaries, they were community responsibilities. The night set the agenda for the day. The San of Southern Africa did something similar around their fires. Sleep often came in clusters, with stories and dreams exchanged as people woke intermittently. A hunter might recount a dream of an antelope, and others would treat it as guidance for the hunt. The line between dreaming and planning blurred. To ignore a dream was as unwise as ignoring a fresh set of tracks. Collective survival hinged not just on shared labor, but on shared sleep. In some Amazonian groups, dawn meant a flurry of dream reports, with families recounting visions over the morning fire. Dreams of snakes, jaguars, or floods could reshape the day's choices: where to hunt, whether to travel, who to avoid. Children's dreams were considered especially potent, as if their souls wandered more freely, less tethered by skepticism. The whole community leaned in, passing omens from the half-coherent ramblings of a half-awake child. Even architecture reflected this collectivity. Longhouses in North America, yurts on the steppe, and igloos in the Arctic all gathered families under one roof, turning sleep into a shared atmosphere. The boundaries between dreams seeped together in those tight spaces, where one person's murmurs or cries became part of the other's night. Privacy was a modern luxury. For much of human history, dreaming was an open conversation. The eerie part is how much weight was placed on collective dreaming. If 2 or 3 people dreamt of the same figure or animal, it was treated as undeniable proof that the spirit world had spoken. Night wasn't random. It was orchestrated, with multiple witnesses to confirm the message. When the same symbol visited different sleepers, it was less a coincidence and more a cosmic consensus. And then there was the ritual of storytelling. Dreams were not simply remembered. They were performed, retold with gestures and embellishments, until they became myth. What began as one person's midnight vision could evolve into a story told for generations. Collective sleep became the workshop of collective memory, forging myths from the fragile clay of dreams. This intertwining of sleep, survival, and ritual showed that dreams weren't just personal entertainment. They were blueprints, rehearsals, warnings, or blessings for the whole group. And if dreams could bring ancestors into the circle or warn of danger on the horizon, then sleep itself became a family affair with spiritual implications. From there, it wasn't hard to imagine that the dead, those permanently asleep, might also drift into this nightly conversation, sliding into dreams to remind the living that the boundary between worlds was thinner than morning light suggested. The dead rarely stayed quiet in human imagination. Night after night, they crept into sleep, slipping into dreams as if invited, though no one had left the door open. Across cultures, the link between lying still in sleep and lying still in death was too obvious to ignore. One was temporary, the other permanent, but both looked eerily alike. Breathing slowed, eyes shut. The body went limp. How could people not conclude that sleep was a nightly rehearsal for the grave? Dreams confirmed it. Ancestors often appeared to the living while they slept, delivering advice, warnings, or complaints. In Polynesia, a dream of a deceased relative could mean a blessing or a rebuke, depending on the tone of the encounter. In many Native American traditions, the dead used dreams to guide hunters, to pass down songs, or to remind the living of ritual duties. To wake from such a dream wasn't unsettling. It was a summons. The past had tapped the present on the shoulder, but not every ancestor arrived kindly. Nightmares were frequently understood as dangerous encounters with the spirits of the dead. In ancient Mesopotamia, demons associated with restless corpses were blamed for crushing sleepers at night, the eerie prototype of what today is called sleep paralysis. In medieval Europe, the dead were sometimes thought to sit on the chest of the living, pressing the breath out of them. Night terrors were less a medical condition than a late-night haunting. These beliefs made the sleeping body a vulnerable sight. Protective rituals multiplied to keep the dead at bay. In Madagascar, charms were placed near the bed to block unwanted spirit visits. Among the Zulu, prayers were whispered before sleep to guide dreams into safe channels and to invite only benevolent ancestors. And in Mesoamerican traditions, certain herbs or amulets were thought to shield the sleeper from wandering ghosts who might mistake a dreamer's soul for company. The association between death and dreaming also shaped burial practices. Egyptians called death the Great Sleep and designed tombs to look like eternal bedrooms, stocked with pillows, headrests, and linens. The soul was thought to continue its nightly travels only now without interruption. In Greek myth, Hypnos' sleep and Thanatos' death were brothers, which must have felt like an uncomfortable truth. Every time someone drifted off, they were briefly in death's company. For communities without writing, these nightly visitations were also a way to preserve history. Ancestors appeared in dreams, not just as family, but as carriers of memory. They reminded people of migrations, of battles, of taboos. The dream became a classroom staffed by the dead. Forgetting to honor these visions risked both spiritual offense and practical ignorance. In societies where memory was survival, sleep was an archive curated by ghosts. The eerie continuity is hard to miss. Even now, people report dreams of lost loved ones that feel more like encounters than recollections. The ancient fear hasn't evaporated. It's just been renamed as psychology. But for thousands of years, these night visits weren't therapy. They were proof that the living and the dead continued their relationship after sundown. And once you accept that dreams are openings for the dead, it makes sense that people devised ways to guard their sleep more carefully, building defenses against unwanted visitors, both human and not. If sleep was a nightly journey and dreams were meetings with gods, ancestors, or unwelcome intruders, then bedtime needed reinforcements. The body lying still on the ground was vulnerable, but the soul drifting off was even more so. Across cultures, protective charms and rituals grew like hedges around the sleeping body, subtle fortifications against the unseen traffic of the night. Consider the Ojibwe dreamcatcher, now a commercial trinket, but originally a delicate filter of spiritual traffic. Hung above children's sleeping places, it was meant to let good visions pass through while tangling the bad. The idea wasn't decoration, it was spiritual pest control. In parts of West Africa, small amulets stuffed with herbs or verses were tied around a sleeper's neck, turning the body into its own defensive shrine. Polynesian families placed carved wooden figures by their mats, guardians staring outward into the dark as the dreamer's eyes turned inward. Beds themselves often carried symbolic weight. Egyptians slept with headrests carved from wood or stone, sometimes inscribed with protective spells. These weren't ergonomic experiments, they were talismans against demons creeping in through the ears or mouth. In Madagascar, the orientation of the bed mattered. Sleeping with one's head facing west was avoided because it aligned with the land of the dead. Among the Sami, reindeer hides were laid in careful patterns, believed to shield the sleeper's soul from wandering too far. The rituals could be small gestures or elaborate productions. In the Islamic world, verses from the Quran were recited before sleep as protection from jinn. Medieval Christians crossed themselves or invoked guardian angels, folding doctrine into drowsiness. In Japan, families placed charms against nightmares akumu at the bedside, sometimes written on paper and burned after use. Everywhere, the act of lying down was never just biological. It was ceremonial. a soft descent into vulnerability wrapped in defense. Children were often at the center of these precautions. Their souls were thought to be especially light, prone to floating away or being stolen. In the Amazon, mothers whispered incantations as they laid children on mats, coaxing their souls to stay tethered. In Central Asia, red cloth was tied near cradles to repel spirits with its striking color. Across Europe, lullabies doubled as protective spells, soothing and shielding in the same breath. To sing a child to sleep wasn't just tender, it was strategic. The universality of these measures shows how little faith humans placed in the idea of safe sleep. The night was too porous, the body too fragile, the soul too adventurous. Without rituals, the risk was too high: illness, nightmares, or death itself. So every society invented small guardians to watch while the dreamer wandered. But no charm could block everything. Some spirits, ancestors, or visions were invited deliberately. Protective rituals didn't close the door entirely, they just kept out the riffraff. The bed was both fortress and doorway, and choosing the right charms meant deciding who could step through. And when religions institutionalized this tension, they didn't just guard sleep, they began to regulate it, shaping when, how long, and under what conditions one was even allowed to rest. If ordinary families built charms and rituals to defend the sleeper, religions went further. They began managing sleep itself. Night, after all, was too important to leave to chance. The body might want rest, but the soul was supposedly at its most open when the eyelids fell. That meant institutions, monasteries, temples, ascetic orders stepped in to choreograph how much, when, and even why people slept. Christian monasticism treated sleep with suspicion. Too much of it looked dangerously like laziness, a gateway to sin. The rule of Saint Benedict demanded monks rise in the dead of night for vigils, breaking rest into fragments. The idea was simple: if demons prowled at night, better to be awake chanting psalms than lying vulnerable in dreams. Sleep wasn't abolished, but it was rationed, turned into a spiritual discipline. Even the position mattered. Flat on the back risked lustful dreams, while sleeping upright or on hard boards kept the body alert. The soul braced against temptation. In Buddhism too, sleep was reined in. Monks trained to minimize hours of rest, sometimes sleeping upright or in seated meditation. The Buddha himself was often depicted lying down, but in the posture of enlightenment, not of drowsy surrender. Sleep, in this sense, was not for pleasure. It was a stage for discipline, where awareness had to be preserved even in drifting. Falling into unconsciousness without mindfulness wasn't just rest, it was failure. Islamic traditions also contained intricate rules about sleep. Certain positions were encouraged, others discouraged. Prayers before bed, rising for night prayers, and waking before dawn structured rest around devotion. To sleep too much was to flirt with negligence. To sleep correctly was to mirror prophetic example, transforming an ordinary biological need into an act of worship. And then there were the ascetics, who treated sleep as an enemy altogether. Desert hermits in late antiquity prided themselves on surviving with minimal rest, regarding sleep as a sly cousin of death that weakened vigilance. Some Hindu sadists practiced standing or sitting for days to avoid lying down, collapsing only briefly before resuming. In extreme cases, sleep deprivation was seen as a spiritual weapon, shaking the soul loose from its ordinary limits and forcing visions into being. But not all religious control was about less sleep. Some traditions structured more elaborate forms of sacred sleeping. In Greek incubation rites, sleeping in temples was obligatory for those seeking divine counsel. In parts of West Africa, ritual sleep was staged with drumming or chanting, guiding entire groups into trance-like slumber, where spirits were expected to arrive. Sleep wasn't just permitted, it was engineered, turned into a communal sacrament. What ties these practices together is the conviction that sleep was too spiritually charged to be left unregulated. The state between consciousness and unconsciousness was porous, and institutions rushed to fence it with rules. Whether through cutting it short, staging it ritually, or choreographing its posture, religions treated sleep as a border zone where the sacred and the dangerous brushed up against the human body. And even when modern science began redefining sleep as a matter of brain states and circadian rhythms, people never completely let go of this older idea that in sleep, the spirit wandered somewhere meaningful. Which explains why, even in an age of psychology and neuroscience, sleep still carries traces of the sacred. But those traces didn't vanish into thin air. They trickled into modern thought, reshaped into theories of the unconscious, and rebranded as personal truths rather than divine decrees. When science took over the night, it didn't erase the sacred, it simply translated it into new languages. Dreams became the domain of psychology, but the weight they carried never really disappeared. Freud, with his cigar and his endless case studies, framed dreams as coded expressions of the unconscious. Jung went further, treating them as archetypal messages bubbling up from some collective reservoir of human memory. Strip away the jargon, and it's hard not to hear echoes of the old logic. Sleep delivers messages. The soul wanders. The dream is worth decoding. The priest became the analyst. The ritual became the session, and the gods were renamed complexes. Anthropologists note how indigenous traditions never abandoned their dream cosmologies. Among the Australian Aboriginal peoples, the dreaming remains central, describing a sacred time outside time, accessible in sleep and visions. For the Iroquois, dream-sharing rituals persisted into modernity, showing how little interest communities had in reducing dreams to random neurons firing. Even today, many indigenous groups treat sleep as a spiritual act, a daily chance to engage ancestors, spirits, and landscapes that remain invisible in daylight. Meanwhile, modern popular culture reinvents the old anxieties with fresh vocabulary. Sleep paralysis, once explained as demons pressing on the chest or dead relatives stealing breath, now circulates as both a medical condition and a paranormal experience. People still report shadowy figures at the bedside, just as Mesopotamians once spoke of Lilichu demons or medieval peasants feared night hags. Neurology and folklore overlap in the same uneasy bed. Technology, ironically, has revived the sacred aura of sleep by promising to measure it. Sleep trackers and apps chart cycles with graphs that resemble ancient divination tables. The old dream books listed crocodiles, floods, and snakes. Now the phone lists REM stages, deep sleep, and sleep debt. Both claim authority over what happened in the night, and both reassure us that the mysteries of sleep can be managed with the right tools. The difference is that one blamed famine on a pharaoh's nightmare, and the other blames your mood on skipping 2 hours of deep sleep. New Age movements have also leaned heavily on dream spirituality. Lucid dreaming is taught as a discipline, echoing shamanic techniques of navigating dreams consciously. Workshops promise journeys, insights, and healing in night visions. Astral projection guides borrow directly from the old wandering soul theories, complete with warnings about hostile forces. What Paleolithic hunters whispered around fires now circulates in wellness seminars with better lighting. Yet beneath the repackaging, the core anxiety remains. Sleep is not just rest, it's exposure. Something leaves, something happens, and something returns changed. People still wake convinced that a dream has rearranged them, still tell stories of dead relatives who visited, still fear the inexplicable weight of nightmares. Neuroscience might dismiss these as misfired neurons, but the lived experience feels older, heavier, closer to those nights when ancestors were believed to pull at the edge of the blanket. So the modern echoes are less about continuity than persistence. No matter how many times sleep is studied, graphed, or explained, it refuses to shrink into mere biology. The human mind still treats it as a crossing, a borderland where meaning seeps in, and maybe that's the point. For thousands of years, sleep has been the daily reminder that people aren't entirely in control of themselves, and whether it's spirits, ancestors, or subconscious impulses waiting on the other side, the moment the eyes close, something else takes over.